The Blue Room at City Hall occupied the southeast corner of the building's second floor, overlooking City Hall Park. On the afternoon of March 8, 1966, the room was arranged for a press conference, with a podium positioned against the room's ornate wood paneling and approximately 30 folding chairs arranged in rows facing it. The Blue Room was typically used for formal mayoral announcements and ceremonial occasions, and its selection for this particular press conference signaled that the mayor's office considered the event to be important enough to warrant the building's most prestigious public space. At 2:15, Mayor Robert Wagner entered the Blue Room accompanied by his press secretary and 2 senior aides. Wagner had served as New York City's mayor since 1954, winning 3 consecutive terms by maintaining the support of various Democratic Party factions while managing the city's complex governmental operations and navigating the political pressures that characterized mid-1960s New York. Wagner was 65 years old, dressed in a dark blue suit with a white shirt and conservative striped tie. His appearance was that of a professional politician who had spent decades managing public perception and media relations. The press conference had been called to address questions that had emerged following an investigative article published in the New York Herald Tribune the previous week. The article had suggested that organized crime figures in Harlem maintained relationships with city officials that allowed illegal gambling operations to continue with minimal interference. The article had not mentioned any specific officials by name, but it had described a system of indirect financial contributions and political support that connected Harlem's numbers rackets to City Hall. The article had generated substantial public discussion and had prompted calls from reform advocates for the mayor to address the allegations directly. Wagner began the press conference by stating that he wanted to clarify the city's position on organized crime and to address what he characterized as unfounded speculation about relationships between city officials and criminal figures. Wagner emphasized that his administration maintained strict enforcement of gambling laws and that no one in his administration had any relationships with organized crime figures that would compromise law enforcement efforts. Wagner stated that suggestions of such relationships were irresponsible and undermined public confidence in city government. A reporter from the New York Times asked Wagner specifically whether he or anyone in his administration had any relationship with Ellsworth Johnson, known as Bumpy Johnson, who was identified in the Herald Tribune article as controlling Harlem's numbers operations. Wagner replied that he had no relationship with Johnson, had never met Johnson, and had no knowledge of anyone in his administration having contact with Johnson. Wagner stated that Johnson was a known criminal figure and that the administration's position was that such individuals should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law rather than accommodated or consulted on any matter of city business. Wagner continued by stating that while Tammany Hall had historically been associated with various forms of political corruption, his administration represented a different approach to city government that prioritized integrity and accountability over the patronage systems of earlier eras. Wagner acknowledged that organized crime remained a problem in New York City, but emphasized that his administration was committed to addressing this problem through proper law enforcement channels rather than through any form of accommodation or informal arrangement. The press conference concluded after approximately 25 minutes. Wagner's statements were reported in the next day's newspapers, with headlines emphasizing his denial of any relationship with Bumpy Johnson and his characterization of Johnson as someone with whom city government had no contact or relationship. The statements were generally presented as the mayor's response to recent allegations about organized crime influence, with most coverage treating the denial as definitive and moving on to other aspects of city governance and politics. Bumpy Johnson learned about the press conference that evening when an associate brought him copies of the early edition newspapers. Johnson was at his apartment on West 147th Street, a modest residence that served as his primary living space following his release from Alcatraz in 1963. Johnson read the coverage carefully, paying particular attention to Wagner's specific statements denying any knowledge of Johnson and denying any relationship between his administration and Johnson. Johnson's outward reaction was minimal. He read the articles thoroughly, placed the newspapers aside, and sat quietly for several minutes, looking out the window toward Harlem's streets. There was no visible anger, no immediate response, no phone calls to associates, no statements to anyone present. Johnson simply absorbed the information and began processing what it meant and what response it might require. Over the following hours, Johnson thought systematically through the implications of Wagner's public denial. The denial was strategically understandable. No mayor could publicly acknowledge relationships with known organized crime figures without creating political problems that would be difficult to manage. But the denial was also factually inaccurate in ways that mattered. Johnson had maintained relationships with various officials in Wagner's administration through the same kinds of indirect channels that had characterized Tammany Hall operations for decades. These relationships involved financial contributions that were channeled through intermediaries, political support that was delivered through third parties, and mutual understandings about enforcement priorities that were never discussed directly, but were nonetheless real. Most significantly, Johnson possessed documentation of these relationships. Over the years, Johnson had maintained careful records of the financial contributions that his organization had made to support Wagner's campaigns and to support various officials who worked in Wagner's administration. These contributions had been made through intermediaries and had been structured to avoid creating obvious connections between Johnson and the recipients. But Johnson had maintained internal records that tracked where money had gone, when it had been delivered, and what purposes it had served. This documentation existed because Johnson understood that political relationships based on informal arrangements and deniable connections required some form of verification to remain functional. Both parties needed to know what had been provided and what was expected in return, even if this knowledge could never be acknowledged publicly. Wagner's public denial created a problem that extended beyond simple dishonesty. By denying any knowledge of Johnson and by characterizing Johnson as someone with whom the administration had no contact, Wagner was effectively repudiating the informal arrangement that had allowed Harlem's numbers operations to function with manageable law enforcement pressure. The denial suggested that Wagner might be preparing to increase enforcement in Harlem as a way of demonstrating that his administration had no accommodating relationship with organized crime. More broadly, the denial positioned Johnson as someone who could be publicly disavowed without consequence, someone whose political support and financial contributions could be accepted privately while being denied publicly. Johnson recognized that allowing this denial to stand unchallenged would establish a dangerous precedent. If Wagner could deny any relationship with Johnson publicly while continuing to benefit from Johnson's financial contributions and political support privately, then the informal arrangement became entirely one-sided. Johnson would bear all the risks of maintaining the relationship, the risks of making contributions, of providing support, of operating in ways that served the administration's interests, while Wagner would bear none of the obligations that normally accompanied such arrangements. The denial reduced Johnson from a participant in a mutual arrangement to someone who could be exploited and then publicly dismissed. And Johnson understood that responding to the denial required demonstrating that relationships could not be so easily repudiated and that public denials did not erase documented realities. The challenge was to make this demonstration in ways that would compel Wagner to acknowledge the relationship privately, while not creating public revelations that would force Wagner to respond with aggressive enforcement that would harm everyone involved. Johnson needed to show Wagner that denying the relationship was more costly than acknowledging it, but to do so without creating a public crisis that would eliminate the possibility of continuing the arrangement on more respectful terms. Over the following week, Johnson developed a strategic approach to responding to Wagner's denial. The core of the strategy was selective disclosure of documentation to people and institutions that would create pressure on Wagner, without creating a public scandal that would force Wagner into positions from which he could not retreat. Johnson would demonstrate that the relationship between his organization and Wagner's administration was documented and could be proven, but would do so in ways that gave Wagner opportunities to adjust his position rather than forcing him to defend the denial publicly. Johnson began by convening a small group of trusted associates and advisors who could help implement the response. The first person Johnson consulted was Eleanor Morrison, an attorney who had represented Johnson on various legal matters since the 1950s. Morrison was 62 years old, a graduate of Howard University Law School who had practiced in New York for 4 decades. Morrison had extensive experience navigating the intersections between criminal law, political corruption, and civil rights advocacy. Morrison understood how documentation could be used strategically and how to communicate with political figures through channels that allowed for negotiation without creating public confrontations. Johnson explained the situation to Morrison and provided her with copies of the financial records that documented contributions his organization had made to support Wagner's campaigns and administration. These records showed specific amounts, dates, intermediaries who had delivered the contributions, and in some cases notations about what enforcement outcomes or policy decisions had followed the contributions. The records were detailed and would be compelling to anyone who examined them, though they were Johnson's internal records rather than official receipts or publicly filed documents. Morrison reviewed the records carefully and confirmed that they would be persuasive evidence of a relationship between Johnson's organization and Wagner's administration. Morrison advised that the records should not be released publicly because doing so would create legal risks for everyone involved and would eliminate Wagner's ability to negotiate. Instead, Morrison recommended a strategy of selective disclosure to intermediaries who would convey to Wagner that the documentation existed and could become public if Wagner continued to deny the relationship or moved to increase enforcement in Harlem. Johnson also consulted with Thomas Garrett, a certified public accountant who had worked with various Harlem businesses and who understood how financial transactions could be documented and traced. Garrett was 58 years old, an African-American professional who had built a successful accounting practice serving both legitimate businesses and clients with more ambiguous operations. Garrett reviewed Johnson's records and helped prepare them in formats that would be immediately comprehensible to people examining them. Garrett created summaries showing the total amounts contributed over different time periods, the channels through which contributions had flowed, and the patterns that connected contributions to specific political events or enforcement decisions. The third key advisor Johnson consulted was Reverend James Crawford, a minister at one of Harlem's prominent churches who maintained relationships with various city officials and who served as an informal liaison between Harlem's community leadership and City Hall. Crawford was 70 years old, someone who had navigated Harlem's political landscape for 5 decades and who understood how to communicate difficult information to political figures in ways that allowed for face-saving responses. Crawford had credibility with both Harlem residents and city officials, making him an effective intermediary for sensitive communications. Johnson met with Crawford and explained that he needed to communicate to Wagner that the public denial was problematic and that documentation existed showing the denial was inaccurate. Johnson emphasized that he was not seeking to create a public scandal, but rather to establish that the relationship needed to be acknowledged at least privately, and that Wagner could not simply disavow the arrangement whenever public pressure made such disavowal politically convenient. Crawford understood the delicate nature of this communication and agreed to serve as an intermediary. Crawford had relationships with several members of Wagner's administration whom he had worked with on various community issues over the years. Crawford could approach these officials in contexts that appeared to be about community matters while conveying information about Johnson's concerns and about the documentation that Johnson possessed. With these key advisors in place, Johnson developed a multi-stage strategy for responding to Wagner's denial. And the first stage involved having Morrison send a letter to Wagner's corporation counsel, the city's chief legal officer, requesting a meeting to discuss matters related to law enforcement practices in Harlem. The letter was carefully worded to be formal and professional, with no explicit threats or references to Johnson, but it established that Johnson's attorney was seeking dialogue with the administration on matters that could be characterized as relating to civil rights and equitable enforcement. The second stage involved having Garrett prepare a detailed financial analysis that showed patterns of contributions flowing from Harlem-based sources to Wagner's campaigns and to officials in his administration. This analysis was designed to be shown selectively to people who would understand its implications but would not be released publicly. The analysis documented contributions totaling approximately $125,000 over Wagner's 3 terms as mayor, channeled through various intermediaries, and structured to avoid creating obvious connections, but nonetheless forming a clear pattern when examined comprehensively. The third stage involved having Reverend Crawford communicate to key Wagner administration officials that there was concern in Harlem about the mayor's recent statements and that documentation existed showing relationships that the mayor had denied. Crawford's communications emphasized that Harlem's community leaders wanted to maintain constructive relationships with City Hall, but that public denials of relationships that actually existed created problems of trust and respect that needed to be addressed. Johnson also enlisted the support of two journalists who covered Harlem affairs and who had relationships of trust with Johnson built over years of interaction. These journalists were not asked to publish anything immediately, but were provided with background information about the financial contributions and were told that they might receive more detailed information in the future if the situation was not resolved through private channels. This created the possibility of public disclosure without requiring immediate publication, giving Wagner's administration an incentive to negotiate before any information became public. The execution of this strategy began in the third week of March 1966. Morrison sent her letter to the Corporation Council on March 21st, formally requesting a meeting to discuss law enforcement practices in Harlem and their potential civil rights implications. The letter was professional and measured, but established Morrison's client's interest in engaging with the administration on these matters. On March 23rd, Reverend Crawford met with Deputy Mayor Timothy Costello, an official whom Crawford had worked with on various housing and community development issues. The meeting was ostensibly about planning for summer youth programs in Harlem, a legitimate topic that Crawford and Costello had discussed before. But during the conversation, Crawford mentioned that he had heard concerns from community leaders about the mayor's recent press conference and about statements that seemed to mischaracterize relationships between Harlem and City Hall. Crawford stated that he understood the mayor faced political pressures, but that denying relationships that were known to exist created problems of credibility and trust that could make future cooperation more difficult. Costello listened to these comments without committing to any specific response, but Crawford observed that Costello took careful notes and seemed to understand that Crawford was communicating something significant. Crawford mentioned that some community leaders had documentation of financial support that had been provided to the administration over the years, and that while no one wanted to create public problems, the recent denial made people question whether their support was valued or whether it would simply be disavowed whenever politically convenient. Over the following 2 weeks, additional communications flowed through various channels. Morrison received a response from the Corporation Counsel's office acknowledging her letter and indicating willingness to meet, though no specific date was proposed. Crawford had 2 additional conversations with administration officials in which he reinforced that documentation existed and that Harlem's community leadership hoped these matters could be addressed through respectful dialogue rather than through public confrontation. During this period, Johnson also ensured that enforcement patterns in Harlem remained visible to Wagner's administration. Johnson's organization continued operating the numbers game exactly as it had before Wagner's press conference, making no changes in response to the mayor's statements. This continuation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that Johnson was not intimidated by the public denial. It showed that Johnson's operations could continue regardless of the mayor's public position, and it created ongoing evidence that, whatever Wagner had said publicly, the actual enforcement relationship remained unchanged. By early April, Wagner's administration began responding more substantively to the pressure Johnson had created. Morrison received a call from the Corporation Counsel indicating that the mayor's office would be willing to meet, but wanted to understand what specific issues Morrison's client wished to discuss. Morrison explained that her client was concerned about statements the mayor had made that appeared to mischaracterize relationships between the administration and Harlem's community and business leaders, and that documentation existed showing that these statements were inaccurate. Morrison emphasized that her client sought respectful acknowledgement of these relationships rather than public confrontation. This communication initiated a series of back-channel negotiations that occurred over the following 3 weeks. Wagner's administration sent various intermediaries to meet with Morrison, with Crawford, and eventually with representatives of Johnson's organization. These meetings occurred in private settings: law offices, church meeting rooms, restaurants where privacy could be maintained, and involved careful discussions about what documentation existed, what Wagner's administration was willing to acknowledge privately, and what arrangements might address Johnson's concerns about being publicly disavowed. And the negotiations revealed Wagner's administration's central concern. The mayor could not publicly retract his statements denying knowledge of Johnson without creating a political crisis that would raise questions about what Wagner had lied about and why. Any public acknowledgement of relationships with Johnson would generate demands for investigation and would undermine Wagner's political position fundamentally. The administration needed any resolution to occur entirely through private channels, with no public dimension that would force Wagner to explain or justify his earlier statements. Johnson understood this constraint and was willing to work within it, provided that the private acknowledgement was genuine and that Wagner's administration committed to maintaining the enforcement relationship on terms that showed respect for Johnson's position. Johnson did not need Wagner to retract the public denial. He needed Wagner to acknowledge privately that the denial had been politically motivated rather than factually accurate, and to commit that future public statements would not similarly mischaracterize or disavow the relationship. By late April, the negotiations produced an informal understanding that addressed both parties' concerns. Wagner's administration acknowledged privately that the mayor's statements at the March press conference had been shaped by political pressures and had not accurately characterized the administration's full awareness of various relationships in Harlem. Administration officials confirmed that they valued the political support and financial contributions that had been provided over the years and recognized that these contributions had served the administration's interests by maintaining political stability in Harlem and by providing financial resources for campaigns. In exchange for this private acknowledgement, Johnson agreed not to disclose the financial documentation publicly and not to provide it to journalists or investigators who might use it to create political problems for Wagner. Johnson also agreed to maintain the existing enforcement arrangements without requiring any public statements or official policy changes that would create evidence of the relationship. Additionally, Wagner's administration committed to several specific actions that demonstrated respect for Johnson's position and that provided assurance the relationship would continue on reasonable terms. First, the Corporation Counsel's office would establish a regular communication channel with Morrison through which enforcement concerns could be addressed before they escalated into confrontations. Second, senior administration officials would meet quarterly with Reverend Crawford and other Harlem community leaders to discuss law enforcement approaches and to ensure that enforcement remained balanced and did not target Johnson's operations disproportionately. Third, the administration would not initiate any major enforcement operations in Harlem without providing advance notification through the established communication channels. These commitments were documented in a confidential memorandum prepared by Morrison and acknowledged by the Corporation Counsel's office. The memorandum was not a legally enforceable contract, but rather a record of understanding that both parties could reference if questions arose about what had been agreed. The memorandum's existence ensured that the understanding would not depend entirely on oral representations that might be forgotten or misremembered as personnel changed or as time passed. The resolution of this situation produced several immediate effects. Wagner's administration modified its public rhetoric about organized crime in Harlem, shifting from broad statements about prosecuting all criminal figures to more nuanced language about targeting violent crime and drug trafficking, while recognizing that Harlem had complex community dynamics that required thoughtful enforcement approaches. This shift was subtle enough not to contradict Wagner's earlier statements directly, but was sufficient to signal that the administration's position had evolved. Law enforcement patterns in Harlem remained essentially unchanged, confirming that Wagner's public denial had not resulted in increased pressure on Johnson's operations. The numbers game continued functioning as it had before the March press conference, and police enforcement remained selective and focused on visible problems rather than attempting to eliminate all gambling activity. This continuity demonstrated that the private understanding between Johnson and Wagner's administration had been restored despite the public denial. Most significantly, the episode established precedents that shaped how political relationships with organized crime figures would be managed going forward. Wagner's administration understood that public denials of such relationships, while sometimes politically necessary, could not be maintained if the denials were so categorical that they repudiated arrangements that actually existed. Future public statements would be crafted more carefully to create political distance without explicitly denying all contact or relationship. Johnson's response to Wagner's denial also influenced how other organized crime figures approached political relationships. Johnson had demonstrated that documentation could serve as protection against being disavowed, and that strategic disclosure of such documentation could compel private acknowledgement, even when public acknowledgement was impossible. This lesson spread through organized crime networks in New York and influenced how relationships with political figures were structured and maintained. For Wagner specifically, the episode created vulnerability that affected his political calculations during the final 2 years of his administration. Wagner had entered his third term in 1962, and by 1966 was considering whether to seek a fourth term. The existence of Johnson's documentation and the understanding that this documentation could potentially become public-created risk that Wagner had to factor into his decision-making. When Wagner ultimately decided not to seek re-election in 1968, various factors influenced that decision, but awareness of potential vulnerabilities related to Tammany Hall corruption and to relationships with organized crime figures was among the considerations that made continuing in office less attractive. The broader significance of the episode related to how power functioned in the relationship between organized crime and political institutions. Wagner's March 1966 press conference had represented an attempt to use public denial to escape accountability for private arrangements. By denying any knowledge of Johnson, Wagner had sought to gain the political benefits of appearing tough on organized crime while continuing to receive the benefits that came from maintaining functional relationships with criminal organizations. This approach treated the relationship as entirely one-sided. Wagner could accept support and contributions when they served his interests, but could disavow any connection when acknowledging the relationship became politically inconvenient. Johnson's response had demonstrated that relationships built on mutual benefit created mutual obligations that could not be unilaterally terminated through public denial. Wagner had benefited substantially from the financial contributions and political support that Johnson's organization had provided over 12 years. These contributions had helped finance Wagner's campaigns, had provided resources to officials who worked in Wagner's administration, and it had helped maintain political stability in Harlem by ensuring that community leaders aligned with Johnson had incentives to support Wagner's governance. Wagner could not simply deny receiving these benefits without creating consequences. The documentation Johnson possessed made Wagner's denial provably false and created leverage that Johnson could use to compel private acknowledgement. But Johnson's strategy of selective disclosure rather than public revelation showed sophisticated understanding of how power operates in ambiguous situations. Public disclosure of the documentation would have harmed Wagner, but would also have harmed Johnson by creating intense law enforcement pressure and by eliminating Wagner's ability to maintain the relationship. A private disclosure to carefully selected intermediaries created pressure that compelled negotiation without destroying the relationship entirely. This strategic approach illustrated broader principles about how documentation functions as power. In relationships that operate through informal arrangements and deniable connections, documentation serves as insurance against betrayal. Both parties understand that certain things have occurred and certain benefits have been provided, but these understandings remain informal and unacknowledged. Documentation converts informal understandings into verifiable facts that can be proven if necessary, creating accountability even in relationships that cannot be publicly acknowledged. Johnson's careful maintenance of financial records over years of operation reflected understanding that political relationships were inherently unstable and that protection against future disavowal required preserving evidence of what had actually occurred. The records Johnson maintained were not created with the intention of ever being disclosed. Ideally, their existence would never need to be revealed, but the possibility of disclosure created deterrence against disavowal and created leverage when disavowal occurred despite this deterrence. The episode also illustrated how reputation affects power dynamics. Johnson's reputation for strategic sophistication and for maintaining detailed awareness of his operations meant that when Johnson's attorney contacted Wagner's corporation counsel, the administration had to take the communication seriously. If Johnson had been perceived as someone who operated impulsively or who made claims without evidence, Wagner's administration might have dismissed the communication as empty threats. But Johnson's track record of careful planning and strategic action meant that when Johnson signaled he possessed documentation, the signal had to be treated as credible. This credibility was built over decades of operation in ways that demonstrated competence and strategic thinking. Johnson's successful negotiation with Lucky Luciano in 1935, his maintenance of control over Harlem's numbers operations through complex periods, his ability to resume operations after 9 years in federal prison, and his consistent demonstration of organizational capacity had established a reputation that gave weight to his communications, even when those communications remained indirect and carefully worded. For Reverend Crawford and the other intermediaries who conveyed information between Johnson and Wagner's administration, the episode demonstrated the complex position of community leaders who operated between legitimate institutions and criminal organizations. Crawford genuinely served Harlem's community through his ministry and through his advocacy work with city government. But Crawford also understood that Johnson was part of Harlem's power structure and that effective community leadership required managing relationships with both legitimate institutions and with figures like Johnson, whose operations existed in illegal but economically significant spheres. Crawford's willingness to serve as an intermediary in this situation reflected pragmatic understanding that Harlem's relationship with city government involved complex dynamics that required people capable of communicating across different spheres. Crawford could speak to Wagner's administration with credibility because he had established relationships through legitimate community work. He could speak to Johnson with credibility because he understood Harlem's realities and did not adopt moralistic postures that ignored how power actually operated in the community. This intermediary role placed Crawford in ethically ambiguous positions, but Crawford understood that refusing such roles would not eliminate the relationships between organized crime and political institutions. It would simply mean those relationships would be managed by people with less concern for community welfare. Crawford's participation helped ensure that negotiations between Johnson and Wagner's administration considered community impacts and maintained some degree of accountability to Harlem's residents, even while operating through informal channels. For Eleanor Morrison, Johnson's attorney, and the episode demonstrated how legal practice in contexts involving organized crime required navigating between legitimate advocacy and representation of clients whose activities were fundamentally illegal. Morrison had built her practice by representing clients who operated in Harlem's gray economy, people whose businesses involved gambling, whose enforcement of debts might involve illegal methods, or whose political relationships involved corruption. Morrison provided these clients with legal expertise that helped them navigate systems while maintaining professional standards that kept her practice within bounds of what bar authorities would tolerate. On Morrison's representation of Johnson in responding to Wagner's denial involved no direct participation in illegal activity. Sending a letter requesting a meeting with the Corporation Council was entirely legal, as was negotiating informal understandings about enforcement approaches. But Morrison understood that her client's interests were fundamentally those of someone operating illegal gambling enterprises and seeking to maintain corrupt relationships with political officials. Morrison's professional judgment was that everyone benefited from having these relationships managed through legal channels rather than through violent confrontation or through complete absence of accountability. The financial analysis that Garrett prepared from Johnson's records demonstrated how accounting expertise could serve strategic purposes beyond simple bookkeeping. Garrett's analysis transformed Johnson's internal records into persuasive documentation that clearly showed patterns of contribution and relationship. The analysis made implicit connections explicit, organized dispersed information into coherent narratives, and presented data in formats that would be immediately comprehensible to people examining them for the first time. This transformation of raw data into strategic communication required expertise that went beyond technical accounting knowledge. Garrett had to understand what aspects of the data would be most persuasive to different audiences, and how to present information in ways that supported strategic objectives without overstating claims, and how to create documentation that could be shared selectively without creating unnecessary vulnerabilities. These skills reflected decades of practice working with clients who needed financial information presented in ways that served complex purposes. When Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, approximately 2 years after the confrontation with Wagner's administration, his obituaries in various newspapers described him as a notorious organized crime figure who had controlled Harlem's gambling operations for decades. Some accounts mentioned his relationships with political figures, though these references remained vague and did not detail specific arrangements or documentation. Wagner, who had chosen not to seek re-election and had been succeeded by John Lindsay in January 1966, was not mentioned in connection with Johnson's death. But within New York's political circles and within organized crime networks, Johnson's response to Wagner's March 1966 denial was remembered and discussed. The episode became a reference point for understanding how documentation could serve as leverage in relationships between criminals and politicians, how strategic disclosure could compel private acknowledgement while avoiding public scandal, and how reputation and credibility could amplify the power of evidence. People who worked in or near these spheres understood that Johnson had established a precedent for how to respond when political figures attempted to disavow corrupt relationships, and that precedent influenced how similar situations were managed in subsequent years. The documentation Johnson had maintained remained in the possession of his estate and was never disclosed publicly. Morrison, as executor of certain aspects of Johnson's affairs, ensured that the records were secured and that they would not surface in ways that would create problems for people who had been involved in the arrangements. This discretion honored the private nature of the understanding Johnson had reached with Wagner's administration and demonstrated that Johnson's use of documentation had been genuinely strategic rather than vindictive. The documentation had served its purpose in compelling negotiation, and once that purpose was achieved, protecting the documentation served everyone's interests. For New York City's political system, the episode reinforced awareness that Tammany Hall-style corruption created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by the criminal figures who participated in that corruption. Politicians who accepted contributions from organized crime sources, who provided protection in exchange for political support, and who maintained informal arrangements with criminal organizations, could not simply deny these relationships whenever public pressure made acknowledging them inconvenient. The relationships created mutual dependencies and mutual vulnerabilities that persisted beyond any particular political moment. This awareness contributed to longer-term reforms in how New York City politics operated. As Tammany Hall's influence continued to decline through the 1960s and 1970s, and as campaign finance laws became more stringent and enforcement more serious, the kinds of openly corrupt relationships that had characterized earlier eras became more difficult to maintain. The changes occurred gradually and incompletely, but the direction was toward systems that made it harder for organized crime to purchase political protection through financial contributions and informal arrangements. The specific episode of Wagner's denial and Johnson's response illustrated several enduring truths about power and documentation. First, public statements by powerful institutions do not necessarily reflect private realities, and people who possess evidence of those private realities can use that evidence to compel recognition even when public acknowledgement remains impossible. Second, documentation serves as protection in relationships, where one party might seek to disavow arrangements that have actually existed, creating accountability even in contexts where formal contracts cannot exist. Third, strategic disclosure, revealing evidence selectively to intermediaries who can communicate its implications, can create more effective pressure than public revelation, which often forces parties into defensive positions that eliminate possibilities for negotiation. Most fundamentally, the episode demonstrated that power in relationships between organized crime and political institutions derives from mutual vulnerability rather than from one-sided dominance. Wagner could not simply disavow his relationship with Johnson because Johnson possessed documentation that made Wagner vulnerable to exposure. But Johnson could not simply expose Wagner because doing so would destroy the relationship that served Johnson's interests. Both parties had power, and that power came from their ability to harm each other, combined with their shared interest in avoiding mutual destruction. This balance of mutual vulnerability created space for negotiation and for reaching understandings that served both parties' interests. Wagner acknowledged the relationship privately, committed to maintaining enforcement approaches that did not target Johnson disproportionately, and established communication channels that would prevent future misunderstandings. Johnson refrained from public disclosure, continued operating within bounds that did not create political crises for Wagner, and maintained the discretion that allowed the relationship to continue serving both parties. The quiet ending to this confrontation reflected the mature understanding both parties had about how power operated in their relationship. There was no dramatic public revelation, no resignation or prosecution, no fundamental change in how either party operated. Wagner continued serving as mayor for his final 2 years, managing the city's affairs without the episode creating lasting political damage. Johnson continued operating Harlem's numbers game until his death in 1968, maintaining the independence and community standing he had built over 4 decades. The relationship between the mayor's office and Bumpy Johnson, denied publicly but acknowledged privately, documented carefully but disclosed selectively, illustrated how power in New York City actually operated beneath the surface of official pronouncements and formal legal structures. Understanding this reality required looking past what officials said publicly to examine what documentation revealed about relationships that were too politically sensitive to acknowledge, but too economically and politically significant to eliminate. The story of Wagner's denial And Johnson's response was the story of how evidence compelled recognition, how strategic thinking created leverage, and how sophisticated understanding of power dynamics shaped outcomes in ways that public confrontation never could achieve.